Welcome everyone to the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research Think and Drink series. My name is Samanth Vandermeade. I'm an assistant professor of gender and women's studies in the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice at the University of Wyoming, as well as a member of the Institute for Humanities Research Steering Committee. The title of tonight's conversation is Hydronarratives, an author discussion with Dr. Matthew Henry. I'm tonight's moderator, and I'll introduce our speakers. If you want to keep in touch with us at the Institute, you can send an email to humanities@uwyo.edu, and we'll add you to the mailing list. You can also see recordings of past events on our YouTube channel. Just go to youtube.com and search for the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. With me tonight, we have Dr. Matthew Henry, an assistant instructional professor in the Honors College and affiliate faculty in the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. Dr. Henry's teaching and research interests lie broadly in the environmental humanities, with a specific focus on environmental and climate justice, coloniality, water and energy systems, and just transition frameworks. He's particularly interested in the ways that cultural narratives impact climate policymaking and how existing social liberation movements play a critical role in working toward anti-racist, decolonial environmental futures. He's here to talk about his first book, Hydronarratives, Water, Environmental Justice, and Imagining a Just Transition, which was published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2023. And he's currently working on a second book focused on the intersections of climate change and colonialism. Since joining the University of Wyoming, he's contributed to various climate justice projects and conducted community-focused research on environmental justice and energy transitions in the rural U.S. West. Additionally, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Dan Auerbach, there we go, I got it, Assistant Professor of Sociology in the Department of Criminal Justice and Sociology, and Dr. Corrie Knapp, Assistant Professor of Environment and Society at the Haub School. It's a pleasure to have you all here tonight, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Henry.
All right, thanks, Sam. I appreciate it. And thanks so much, Salem and Scott Henkel and the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research for making this possible. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to sort of give an overview of the origins of this book project tonight and share my screen just briefly with some visual aids to kind of help you understand where the origins of this project come from. So you should be seeing a picture of my book cover. Is that correct?
We are.
Okay, thank you so much. So so Hydronarratives, my book project was published on January 1st of this year, so a good way to start 2023. And I'd like to kind of talk about the origins of the project to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, and then also a sort of brief overview of a couple of the chapters. So when I was working on this book, I was actually this book comes from my dissertation project. So I was actually at Arizona State University when I first started working on this project years and years ago. As I was putting together, my comprehensive exam reading list and working towards my prospectus and so forth, and just putting together the dissertation project, we were experiencing a pretty significantly severe portion of the mega drought that's been plaguing the Western U.S., particularly the Southwest, for the past few decades. And it was really kind of instrumental in how I started to conceptualize this project. So what you're seeing on your screen here is just a couple of statistics that were really germane to how I started thinking about this project in the winter of 2014 and 2015. First of all, the winter of 2014-15 snowpack in the Sierra Nevada mountains was 5% of normal. And likewise, research started coming out showing that the drought event that we'd been experiencing in the lower Colorado River Basin was the worst in about the last 1,200 years or so. But as I was watching coverage in the media of this event, of this really sort of stressful period of time, during the longer drought, I noticed some interesting cognitive dissonance between how media was covering the drought and how I was experiencing it on the ground in central Arizona. So, for example, if you were to go online at that time and try to learn more about the origins of the drought or see how the drought was being documented, there were a number of photo essays that ran in 2014, 2015 in media outlets like ProPublica or the LA Times or the Atlantic and so forth. And they all kind of aestheticize the drought in a really similar way. So you'd see, the sort of famous bathtub ringed reservoirs, Lake Mead, Lake Powell, and so forth, grounded speedboats, these cracked sort of desiccated shorelines and marinas that nobody could access very easily anymore. So this sort of devastation of recreation culture, and then also brown dead lawns in urban and suburban spaces. So really a sort of similar aestheticization of the drought. And likewise, Mark Reisner's book, Cadillac Desert, started popping up sort of everywhere on this required reading list of sorts that you'd see in different coverage of the drought. A lot of people were saying, this is the book you have to read to understand how we got here in the Western US. And of course, Cadillac Desert's famous, right? Because it sort of looks at how John Wesley Powell, who you see here in the bottom right-hand portion of the screen, sort of predicted that drought and water issues would arise if the Western US wasn't settled wisely, right? If it was instead gridded into these 160-acre parcels, which of course it was. So John Wesley Powell's name was coming up a lot. Mark Reisner's book, Cadillac Desert, was coming up a lot. Books like The Water Knife, which is a climate fiction novel, was suggested as sort of context for the drought. And that's all about a sort of dystopian future in which Western states are literally going to war over water. And one of the sort of crux of the book is this hunt for these indigenous water rights that are listed on a piece of paper, and whoever possesses them has sort of access to the remaining water in the basin. And so sort of really interesting coverage of the drought, but very different from what I was experiencing in Phoenix. And so, for example, I had a lot of DNA students in my classes who were constantly bringing up the Navajo Nation water crisis, where about 30% of families don't have access to clean water or reliable water. And that's largely a legacy of settler colonialism. Likewise, I was attending events and sort of being part of this opposition to the Oak Flat project, which is a proposed copper mine owned by Rio Tinto that, if successfully sited, would have significant impacts on the water supply for the San Carlos Apache Reservation. I was learning about and engaging with people who were sort of veterans of the sort of water litigation issues that the Gila River Indian community was facing after having their water stolen by white settlers in the early 1900s in central Arizona. And then, of course, moving on to 2016 and 17, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests erupted. Of course, we all know that's the sort of slogan for the protesters was "Water is life." And that those protests were all about sort of responding to the legacies of settler colonialism and the ways in which fossil fuels in a pipeline would threaten water supplies, but also threaten the broader sort of indigenous community in the region due to climate change. So a number of sort of watershed environmental and water justice issues were unfolding at the time. So what I sort of concluded in watching this sort of dissonance between the coverage of the drought and what I was experiencing on the ground is that a lot of the ways in which the drought was being discussed was through this, what I call a white settler optic. So it was being looked at through the lens of white settler society. So there's often this insistence in coverage of the drought that it's unprecedented, it's historic, it's new, despite the fact that, for more than a century, lots of indigenous peoples in the Colorado River Basin experienced water insecurity due to colonialism. A lot of focus on settler infrastructure, so dams and recreation areas and lawns that I kind of talked about already. And then likewise, the frameworks to understand the drought were really couched in this sort of specific brand of environmentalism. So sustainability or overconsumption were often referenced, or often the drought was discussed in terms of water allocations or acre feet. So this technocratic language that really erased some of these histories of colonial violence. So as I was conceptualizing the project and watching all of this unfold, I realized that I wanted my project to lift what Macarena Gomez Barras calls in her book, The Extractive Zone. She calls them submerged perspectives. And her book is all about indigenous peoples in the Amazon, more or less responding creatively or through different forms of activism to mega projects cited throughout the Amazon, often dams, but also other types of projects as well. And so submerged perspectives, as defined by Gomez Barris, refers to perspectives that perceive local terrains as sources of knowledge and vitality and livability, that offer potential for forms of life that cannot be easily reduced, divided, or representationally conquered and evacuated, and that allow us to see local knowledge that resides within what power has constituted as extractive zones. So really just alternative perspectives that resist extraction, that resist histories of violence and their erasure. So in terms of hydronarratives, I really think about narrative and storytelling broadly within this book. So I'm really interested in sort of how various cultural representations in the aggregate lay the groundwork for thinking about the story of water in the United States as one that's not just viewed through a sort of technocratic lens of economic development and allocations and technology and so forth, but also understood as a story of social injustice, right? And often these narratives I seek to, in the book at least, to sort of figure out ways to connect different water justice struggles in different places and sort of understand them within a broader framework. So that was generally what my dissertation amounted to. But when I came here to the University of Wyoming, I adopted this just transition framework, and part of that was due to the fact that I was working in the School of Energy Resources in the Hobbs School on energy transition research here, and I started thinking through just transition frameworks as a potential framework for my book because it just, I thought, fit really well. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with just transition as a concept that's often invoked to refer to a managed shift toward a low carbon energy system in places where fossil fuels are central to the local economy and the local cultural imaginary, such as Wyoming. And so when we think about just transition in that sense, we're thinking about employment and worker retraining and economic diversification, things that we're all constantly thinking about here in Wyoming as we face the coal transition. But beyond that, in my book, I really wanted to think more capaciously about just transition. And so the climate justice movement offers that opportunity, and in which just transition is defined as a sort of shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy that really pays attention to redressing past harms. So, for example, prioritizing racial justice or prioritizing reparative justice, or in terms of thinking about decolonization or decolonial futures, or centering gender equality or reproductive rights, thinking really broadly about what justice can actually look like. And I thought that fit my book really well in terms of thinking about how cultural narratives and how cultural representations found in things like film and photography and literary fiction and art and so forth can offer visions for and help communities imagine and sort of act as a prism for planning and thinking through and mapping just futures, right? So sort of back to my book, more broadly, I adapted this just transition framework in that sense. And so really the goal here in the book is to find and sort of identify these cultural representations that respond to water injustice, and that also don't just document injustice, but also hint towards alternative futures. So really it's a book about looking to the past to conceptualize the future. And some additional questions I asked in my book too is, if we're thinking about the origins of crisis, whether it's in the Colorado River Basin or it's in Flint, Michigan, or it's in Appalachia, I sort of try to make the argument that the ways in which we think about origins can signal our political commitments and can also either open up or sort of limit our horizons of possibility for just futures in a number of ways. So a couple examples of chapters in my book that I kind of think through this. So I do have a first chapter on the Colorado River Basin, but in my second chapter, I do move to Flint, Michigan. So sort of geographical diversity in terms of water struggles. And in this chapter, I'm really interested in the ways in which we can think about the Flint water crisis as a logical outcome of racial capitalism. And in doing that, I focus on an ethnodrama called Flint, which was directed by a University of Michigan playwright, Jose Casas. And it's an ethnodrama in that he went out into Flint, Michigan, and interviewed around 100 people or so. And then the transcripts from those interviews were performed by University of Michigan theater students. And they're performed verbatim. So in many ways, this play is really similar to the Laramie Project, which is an interesting connection to Laramie here. And in fact, Casas even compares it to the Laramie Project. And what the play does is it really offers audiences a perspective on Flint that doesn't limit the time horizon of Flint to, say, 2012 or 2014, around when the city started thinking about switching its water to the Detroit River to save money, but it actually locates that crisis in a broader history of things like white flight and redlining and this sort of politics of abandonment, in which Flint, which has historically been racialized as Black, has sort of lost been stripped of its ability to sort of govern itself and make decisions for itself, and sort of been really just sort of been excluded from the democratic processes in Michigan more broadly. And so this play offers this alternative sort of history of Flint, right? And then in ways in which I'm thinking through sort of alternative ways of imagining what Flint could look like in the future, I look at a couple of different art projects in the city. One is called the Flint Fit Project, which is a collaboration between an artist named Mel Chin and a fashion designer named Tracy Reese, who's a Detroit native. And what they did was they paid Flint residents to collect like thousands of Nestle water bottles that had been discarded, that had been actually donated by Nestle to the people of Flint during the water crisis. And those were recycled into this fabric that was then spun into this fashion collection. And the collection, so you can see a photo here on your screen, the collection is meant to sort of be a retro garb that's meant to evoke this sort of heyday in Flint, Michigan, in which auto manufacturing was booming, and there was this really strong sort of multiracial working class in a city that was at one time thriving. In addition, I also focus on the Flint Public Art Project, which is a sort of community effort to paint mural art on crumbling infrastructure to change the narrative about Flint as this sort of crumbling place that's not worthy of investment in the future. So to try to change the way people view Flint, and just really broadly, I'm thinking about the ways in which these initiatives imagine what Robin Kelly calls freedom dreams, particularly the ways in which he talks about freedom dreams for Black liberation in terms of reparations movements after the Civil War and all the way up into the present. So that's really where I'm thinking about just transition intersecting with sort of racial justice and social liberation. To contrast that, my third chapter does something different, and some of you may have seen this work before because I've presented on it here at the University of Wyoming. But in my third chapter, I moved to Appalachia, and I focus a lot on a range of cultural representations that challenge the centrality of extractive labor to the regional cultural imaginary. So some interesting parallels in Appalachia and thinking about Wyoming and how coal and also natural gas extraction and working in that industry has cultural significance, right? And so there are a number of novels, some poetry, some photography that focus on fracking and mountaintop removal, coal mining, that sort of challenge that and sort of offer maybe a hint at what a post-extractive Appalachia might look like. And then I concentrate on a few different sort of artistic initiatives that imagine explicitly what a post-extractive Appalachia might look like. And so one of those is, so you're looking at the blueprints here on your screen, kind of in the center here. One of those projects is called the Acid Mine Drainage and Art Project, and it's an environmental reclamation art installation in a town in Pennsylvania called Vintondale. And there was a coal mine there that shuttered in the 1950s, and the town has sort of always been in an economic depression since then. But in the early 2000s, this group of researchers and artists, there's a hydrologist and a historian and some landscape architects, conceptualized this plan to clean up a nearby creek that flows through the center of town that's been polluted by acid mine drainage from that abandoned mine. And what they do is they actually created these limestone lined ponds that actually naturally filter out iron oxides from water. And so they reroute the creek through these ponds. And then when it re-enters the creek, the water's clean. What they did, which is really interesting, is they planted trees next to these ponds, and the trees are different species. And so in the fall, their leaves change color, and the color progression is different for each species of tree. But they were planted to match the changing color of the water as it progresses through the ponds, as the iron oxides filter out from rusty hues of red and brown to orange and so forth. And likewise, this space is now usable. So there's a baseball diamond and a picnic area and a walkable space that commemorates the town's coal heritage. So it's not just doing a clean break from the past, it's just thinking about that, it's honoring that heritage, but moving beyond it. And then additionally, another project I look at is, so this big red circle on your right is a piece of art by a man named John Sabra in Ohio. And what he does is, similarly, he filters out acid mine drainage from ponds and from streams in central Ohio and turns them into paint pigments and then makes art. He calls it toxic art. And then he sells that art and paints he makes out of those pigments, and uses the money to finance water cleanup efforts in the region. And so that picture on the cover of my book is another piece by John Sabra that he kindly agreed to allow to be on the cover. And I actually interviewed him for the book, and he's a sort of really fascinating guy, and actually has a Wyoming connection. So if he's ever out here, we'll have to have him give a talk. But so those are kind of the ways, I'm thinking about connecting these sort of seemingly disparate water justice issues. And, I don't even talk about my fourth chapter, which thinks about water in terms of sea level rise and gentrification in coastal cities and so forth. So I'm happy to talk about that more during the Q&A. So that's about all I have for the origins of my book, and I'm excited to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. I appreciate that. So I will let our commentators commentate then, and I will monitor the Q&A for audience questions when the time comes.
Would you like to jump in, Dan? I don't want to.
It does not matter to me. If you got a burning question, go ahead, Corrie.
Well, I do have a question that I'm really curious about, because it's something that I think about a lot, and reading parts of your book have made me really curious about your thinking about that. And this is the connection between knowledge and power. And how do you think just transitions really require the way we think about how we know? And this has implications, I think, for academic institutions like ours, for the process of science. Yeah. So I just wanted to get a little bit of your thinking around that.
It's a great question. So I'll preface this by saying that if I had read Max Laborion's book, Pollution is Colonialism, before I'd written this book, it would figure into a large part of it, I think, because it's all about doing anti-colonial pollution science, rethinking what knowledge counts as expertise and what doesn't within broader scientific discourse, and how, ceding ground to other ways of knowing is really important to thinking about just transition and environmental justice more broadly. Sadly, I don't even think that book might not even have been out yet when mine was in press, but it's really influenced my thinking since then. So I can point to that first chapter of my book, which is about this idea really about, it's sort of framed around Kyle White's idea of collective continuance, indigenous collective continuance, or social resilience, and the degree to which different societies have or do not have a capacity for social resilience based on the ways in which they know the environment, the ways in which they interact with the environment. So he talks a lot about, he's Potawatomi. He talks about the various ways in which social resilience is manifested in terms of like kinship ties with both humans and non-humans, and sort of really different ways of engaging with the non-human world in which there's sort of this non-hierarchical engagement with the non-human world, which is pretty absent from the ways in which we dominant ways in which we think about water in the Western US, which is very technocratic and sort of all about, technology and acre feet and all these metrics and so forth. So these different ways of thinking about social resilience are really important. And so when I'm looking at collective continuance in this chapter, what I really try to do is highlight the ways in which Indigenous peoples in the Phoenix Valley are sort of insisting that, they haven't been erased, and that there's this past, particularly in Phoenix, in which Indigenous peoples, cultivated vast fields of crops, the Hohokam, which are ancestors of the O'odham who are presently there, and there's multiple groups of O'odham, had something like 1,000 miles of irrigation canals in the central part of the Phoenix Valley, and they were there for like hundreds and hundreds of years, sort of succeeding in this arid space. And whereas sort of the settler approach to water management has lasted like 200 years and it's about out of steam. And so it's this really interesting sort of way of thinking about social resilience, but also like when you go to Phoenix, there's sort of this settler overlay in the city, like the old canals the Hohokam used are now the canals that the Central Arizona Project uses. And so it's really easy to sort of miss that presence there, and the fact that there's a different way of knowing and engaging with water in a place. And so I argue sort of it's really important to recognize those alternative ways of knowing, those different ways of knowing, and incorporate them into hydropolitics in the Western US. And so that's really an argument about let's expand, let's not expand, but let's seed ground to other ways of knowing. That's going to be really important in sort of thinking about resilience in the future. So I really appreciate that question, and it's something I continue to think about more now, even since I've written this. So.
And kind of building off of that and that discussion of cultural identity, land and place, that nexus there, I was wondering if you could just drill down in some specific examples, say distinctions between a conceptualization of identity, place, and land in extractive societies versus those based in regenerative societies or restorative ecology.
Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated question, right? Because, in places like Appalachia or Wyoming, like there is a place-based identity that often is in tension with this sort of pride in extractive labor. And so it's not necessarily that they're mutually exclusive, at least in terms of the way people identify, right? So I think about the way here in Wyoming, for example, in which like the School of Energy Resources will conduct a survey on community values in Wyoming. And like a top one is like outdoor recreation and loving the land, but it's totally incompatible with like this extractive sort of dependence on extraction. And so I think they can exist in tension in the same place. And that's sort of a conundrum, right? And same thing, it's important not to universalize here. Like in Central Arizona, there are other ways of engaging with water. The Gila River Indian community won a couple of water rights settlements in the early aughts that allowed them to sort of cultivate traditional crops again after not having been able to do so for nearly a century. So that's really important. But like other communities in the region, and I'm thinking about like in New Mexico, indigenous communities in the Four Corners region long were part of the extractive and fossil fuel economy because that's what they wanted to do. And that was part of this sort of expression and manifestation of sovereignty. And I think it's important to recognize that, like, we can't generalize about who's doing what correctly. And it's in sovereignty here and self-determination is really important. So I think that sometimes those life ways or those ways of knowing and relating to the land can be in tension, and we certainly see it here, here in Wyoming. And so I think that's kind of how something that I would have liked to tease out more in the book. I don't know if there was space or an opportunity, but it's been something I've been thinking about more, particularly in the classes I've been teaching. But yeah, I think that's a great question.
But it's there in when you talk about that false dichotomy between jobs and environment, right?
Right. Yeah, it is there. Yeah.
And we set this up as it's only environment versus economic development, but that is a false dualism in which the people that exist there are the ones who've been alienated through a process of extractive accumulation.
Exactly. Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting because that's the origins of just transition as a framework. We're literally about trying to offer a narrative alternative to the jobs versus the environment impasse. And like, you know, I could go into the history of that, but like Tony Mazzocchi, who sort of came up with the idea of just transition, literally talked about changing the narrative. Like he was talking in narrative tones, and he wasn't thinking about cultural representations. He was thinking about sort of the broader epistemology in which we position economy versus environment. So you're absolutely right. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind is they can exist at the same time. So absolutely.
Yeah, I'm curious, kind of connected to that. I think that this the justice framework is so important when we're thinking about climate change and how it manifests in the way that, you know, it impacts our water, it impacts our food, it impacts, you know, our sense of place, so all of these various things. But I am interested in this tension about justice for whom. And I think that is interesting because with climate change, I think that will be dynamic. And I think I completely agree with you that there are some historical injustices and systematic things that have happened in the past that climate change maybe gives us an opportunity to address. To lead to deeper levers of change. But I'm just wondering about like how you think about the dynamic nature of climate change and how justice will shift with that, given different winners and losers over time.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been thinking a lot about lithium mining lately, right? So this is the example I've been using in class this semester, but like, you know, we all like the idea of electric vehicles, right? They're going to reduce emissions. That could be really great in, say, urban communities that are, or neighborhoods that are sited near freeways that disproportionately deal with pollution and have higher rates of asthma that are typically racialized. On the other hand, you know, if you go up and down the supply chain, like what justice looks like and for whom really changes. And so if you go to say, right, like now you've got an issue where lithium extraction is, you know, impacting indigenous communities in the Salar de Atacama. And so that's not great, and that's a justice issue. But then, you know, you've got, for example, the Chilean government seeking to nationalize lithium. And part of that is a response to the fact that they, you know, they've sort of, there's always been a sort of push-pull between, say, socialist governments and authoritarian governments, but with the same objective of sort of like modernizing the economy after colonialism. So it's a sort of ongoing long-term response to a colonial past. And so you can think about that in some ways as like a form of justice, is nationalizing this critical mineral, right? And so it depends on where you're looking, and it's a really hard problem because sometimes justice in one place doesn't look like justice in another. It could be at odds with, you know, in those ways. And so, you know, I think it's important, right, for communities to sort of define what justice looks like rather than generalizing what justice looks like, which is why it's important to engage with communities rather than just do academic research from a theoretical perspective. But yeah, I think it's a really important question. Justice for whom is, you know, it depends on where you're looking. And if we're thinking about water or energy, you move up and down the supply chain and it's going to look different in different places. And sometimes they might be at odds.
Corrie, I feel like you've taken a peek at my discussion question list. It's pretty similar in this. I'm really curious, you know, because you cover a lot of ground, right? You make there is an overarching connection between the settler colonialism, racial capitalism, you know, all of these things. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering to what extent if you were to continue on with this research, or as doing this research, if you've come across any other elements, say from a post-humanism discussions of, say, abilities or non-human animals as a part of justice, and how they have been presented or how you think they might be presented.
Yeah, I have. So, I've really been thinking a lot lately about the connections between climate change and colonialism and how that impacts the sort of possibilities and limitations of climate geopolitics. And Amitav Ghosh's book, the Nutmeg's Curse, focuses a lot on the non-human as central to sort of moving past the sort of Euro-Western epistemology in which non-human nature is objectified, commodified, and put in service of capital in ways that have really led us to where we are. And so he uses the term animism, but you really think about this in a number of ways. I mean, it's talked about a lot. So I'm thinking like multi-species justice frameworks, or in Latin America, the concepts advanced by people like Eduardo de Viveiros Castro and Marisol de la Cadena, where they're really thinking about multi-species justice in really interesting ways that have been really central to environmental justice movements in Latin America. This idea of, I use the sort of esoteric term multi-natural perspectivism, but what it really is decentering the human, which is something that's, key to a lot of Amerindian cosmologies, is like the human doesn't sit at the top of this pyramid, but, inanimate objects, non-human animals, et cetera, are all sort of kin, and they think in terms of relationality versus hierarchy. And so that's central to a lot of environmental justice organizing there, but also the rights of nature is a big one, right? So granting personhood to rivers and mountains and so forth, in which they can actually be represented by a surrogate in the courts. So those are a lot of ways in which, for the average person in the US to talk about a river having rights, they might think that's crazy, but what that really is just a sort of epistemological shift beyond objectifying the sort of non-human world to put in the service of capital or other forms of utility, and thinking in terms of relations and in terms of kin. And so I think that's a really radical way of thinking. And I think it has the potential to sort of unstick us in some ways from the sort of types of thinking we're accustomed to. So I have encountered that quite a bit. And I think Amitav Ghosh's book, The Nutmeg's Curse, really gets into that in ways that I think are really accessible for a broader public. So yeah, it's a great question.
I love what you just said about like unsticking us from these maybe pathways of knowing, or like well-trod paths of the way that we know. I think that's so awesome. And it's something that I think about all the time is, what opportunities does climate change give us that we may not have been pushed to take advantage of, or to sit with, to reflect on? I feel like there's a lot of opportunities in terms of rethinking our systems and structures in ways that, may make them more livable for all. So I just wanted to hear some of your thoughts about that, because I think that a lot of what you pull together is kind of these bubbling up of narratives that give us a new view of what the world could be like.
Yeah. So I've really been thinking about climate knowledge production lately, and the ways in which we sort of have a dominant way of talking about climate change, whether that's through the IPCC and their reports, or COP 27, 28 or whatever, or even Euro-Western knowledge production. The fact that most climate work is coming from universities in the global north. But at the same time, there's a lot of really great work that sits at the intersection of scholarship and activism that pushes back on the extent to which there's an overrepresentation of voices from the very places that are driving the climate crisis. And so, I think there's opportunities there to, I completely agree, like this is an opportunity to sort of shake things loose and shake things up. And there's a lot of, whether it's protests in Egypt at COP 27, or whether it's this sort of sudden inclusion of the word colonialism in the IPCC reports, there's this effort to sort of broaden representation about who gets to talk about climate change. And it's not enough. I mean, the IPCC, I've been doing work, and it's related to my next book project, about like who's represented and, and on those, in terms of authorship. It's gendered unevenly. Most researchers come from the global north. Most citations come from the global north or in English. And there's a recognition even among the authors that I know that like this needs to change. And likewise, like their engagement with concepts like colonialism or climate justice are like pretty shallow in their reports. And so I think there's opportunity to improve the way we talk about climate. I think it's hard because it's hard to mainstream that type of work, but and I saw that comment there. What I mean by climate knowledge production is the ways in which research informs policymaking and broader discourse around climate change. So whose research is most influential in the ways we talk about climate change, like in spaces like this, or in the classroom, or in think tanks or policy centers. So that's where I'm really thinking about like who's influencing the climate conversation. But like some work I've been doing recently with a number of humanities, social science scholars, and climate justice activists is we've been working on this report for the last year, this project called the IPCC Shadow Report, and it's basically recruiting underrepresented voices to do a shadow fourth report in response to the inadequacies we view of the second and third working group reports from the sixth assessment. And so that's one way I'm thinking about, like, let's expand what we count as expertise, who has a seat at the table. Here's a way to do it. It's very grassroots effort. We don't even have funding for it. We've just been reaching out to people, and it's been coming together slowly, but there's other efforts like that, parallel efforts from people. And so that's where I think there's a real opportunity to like critique and really think about how we talk about science more broadly. I think that's a really exciting opportunity. And it's when I talk about it in the classroom, students sometimes take it as like, are you saying science is bad? And I'm like, no, I'm not saying science is bad. I'm just saying it's one, maybe like Euro-Western science is maybe one tool in the toolbox. There's other ways of thinking here. So I agree with you. I think there's a huge opportunity. I think it's urgent, so it needs to happen faster, but there are a lot of, there's a lot of really interesting work going on. I think, at least in some of my spaces, that are sort of trying to sort of reframe the way we talk about climate.
Yeah, I wanted to just jump onto that,
Yeah.
because I'm a chapter lead for the National Climate Assessment right now. And one thing
Yeah.
that I've noted is just, it's been really hopeful to see that finally we can cite personal communications with people who have Indigenous knowledge as an equal source of information as scientific data, which is a step in the right direction. But obviously it's a step. Yeah,
a step, definitely. And that's where we're, one thing we've been trying to think about doing is not just underrepresented voices, but also the ways in which climate knowledge is communicated. So not necessarily just in terms of a peer-reviewed article that focuses on Indigenous issues or includes Indigenous knowledges, but also like including testimony or oral tradition or other genres in which that can contribute to the conversation. So, and I think I saw a comment pop up, so I'll just note that project we've been working on. One of the groups that we've been working with is the Center for Interdisciplinary Environmental Justice, that does a ton of work in Mexico and Latin America. So that's one group there's scholars and activists and folks that sort of are in both worlds. So that's predominantly the group we've been working with, a number of Indigenous scholars as well. Amra Solomon is one. Kyle White's been part of our meetings a little bit. So like a number of people, those are some of the issue there, of course, is we don't have as many Global South participants as we'd like. And that's an ongoing issue, right? Is like a lot of the scholarship from the Global South is not easy to come across, or, it's not in English, or there's a number of barriers there to engaging with Global South knowledge production in a similar way. So right now we're mostly in North America, Central America.
Well, I have a couple questions in the Q&A, so I thought I might start. So I actually have two, but I think I'm going to try to condense them into one set of questions because I think they address similar issues. So if you discuss this, I'm reading this from the text, the first question. If you discuss specific cases of energy/climate/environmental justice in the state of Wyoming, what are they, and how do you see Wyoming fitting into the larger discussion in the book? So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question would be, what would it look like for these kinds of just transition narratives to originate from UW? And this person wrote, I'm thinking about research commitments, transdisciplinary courses, reparations, these sorts of things.
Great. I'm glad you asked. So the conclusion to my book is all about Wyoming, and it's less about water and more about just transition in Wyoming. So Corrie, your name's in there, believe it or not. I don't know if you got that far, but I talk about some of the just transition work we've done here. So, you know, what I sort of move away from water as much and think about just transition as a theory of social change and some of the challenges and opportunities we've encountered here. So, for example, and some of you may have heard of this, but so when Corrie and I first started here at the same semester, we put together and conceptualized this narrative initiative, engaging with Wyoming youth around their hopes for the future of the state of Wyoming. And it was actually a really interesting process, because when we first started, and you're familiar with this, Corrie, we laid all this groundwork and we applied for a grant, and then sort of COVID happened and the grant was not funded. And it was really about the fact that we hadn't really built relationships yet here. And like, it was really hard because of COVID. And so we kind of put it on the back burner for a while, and then it was resuscitated through the Ruckelshaus Institute like 2 years ago now. And basically in the form of a contest that was generously funded by the Wyoming Humanities Council. I see Sean Reese is here, so thank you very much. And what this project did was it invited youth in the state of Wyoming to submit narrative responses to their hopes for the state of Wyoming by the year 2030. And they could do it sort of creatively, multimedia, writing, and so forth. And we had funding to give to pay honoraria for judges and to pay winners prize money. And then we published it in this anthology and distributed it at the state legislature. And really the goal of this was to elevate the Wyoming youth, the voices of Wyoming youth, which we viewed as sort of not represented in discussions about the state of the state's future and this sort of conversation about transition. And especially because there's a youth out migration sort of crisis been going on, you know, more or less, you know, trending that direction over the past few years. And so the way we thought about just transition there is, you know, how can we make sure all voices are included to really conceptualize what the transition looks like in Wyoming, a place where, you know, young people don't always necessarily feel like they're welcome, don't see a future here. So that's one way we're thinking about just transition, is, you know, and playing out on the ground through these sort of the avenue of narrative as a way to think about the future and conceptualize it. And, you know, there were a number of really cool themes that came to sort of bubble to the surface in these. So that's, you know, that's the one way in which, you know, I think there's an opportunity to, again, like I use that term submerged perspectives, but really sort of offer and seed ground to and offer platforms for and facilitate conversations that include more voices in those conversations. What that looks like in the state, I mean, it's hard to say, but it would be nice if young people saw a reason to stay, because I think that's where I find inspiration in my teaching, is seeing the ways in which young people are really dynamic about talking about the types of futures they want. And I don't love the idea of them leaving the state then after they graduate and taking those ideas away. So I think that's a really important question to think about how we can do this on the ground, because of course, a lot of the book is about critique and, you know, sort of leaves open what just futures could look like in these different communities. But I feel like being on the ground here, I was able in the book to speak a little bit more to some of the on the ground efforts here.
Yeah, so I think a question that this conversation raised for me is, so I do work in feminist studies, and amongst that includes feminist disability studies. And so as I was thinking and listening to you talk about this concept of futurity, and particularly of what a just future might look like, I'm curious, in any of your case studies, if disability was something that came up, excuse me, in these narratives that you were discussing, because all of these situations are inherently disabling, right? Like the water crisis in Flint is disabling. It's racist and disabling, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious if you can talk more or have an example of the ways in which disability is present in these conversations.
Yeah, so the one example I'll sort of throw out there right now is on my chapter on Appalachia. I didn't spend a lot of time on this, but there are a lot of really interesting initiatives that seek to imagine a more inclusive Appalachia. And one is called Queer Appalachia, and they create a zine and they have programming, and there's this whole, but Queer Appalachia has also been a proponent of disability rights in Appalachia as well. So really thinking about a more inclusive Appalachia. So in terms of, let's move past extraction, but this is not just a different type of economy. It's also a different way of thinking about the future in terms of inclusivity. And so I really like the work that they're doing. And I think I wrote about them for like a paragraph, and they're sort of one of a list of groups that's pushing sort of broader examination of justice beyond just, say, a sort of narrow focus on environmental justice and participatory justice, who gets to be part of the decision-making process. And so their work's really great. And they do push and sort of support disability justice issues in Appalachia. So that's one place that I really saw that. And then the other thing I'll say is, like, there are some themes in the narratives from youth in Wyoming that talked about access to mental health services and a more inclusive space for for disabled people, among others, in the state of Wyoming. So these types of issues really sort of bubble up to the surface, which is why I'm thinking about just transition capaciously. And so I didn't explicitly address a lot of disability concerns, but like they're there. And especially in Appalachia, a number of these advocacy groups I sort of identify really are part of that movement there. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I have some follow-up questions about that for you, and that I would love to ask, but I'm not going to do that here. So audience members, does anyone else have any questions to throw in the chat or in the Q&A? We've got just a few more minutes here. If not, then I'll maybe let Dan and Corrie sort of summarize any last thoughts they might have. Okay, well, I don't see anything, so maybe I'll open it up there. Do the two of you have any questions for Dr. Henry, or any closing thoughts about this conversation?
I appreciate this book so much, Matt, and I feel like it's going to help to inform and help those of us that are working on water in the state. Folks might know that there's this big Y-Act grant that's recently been funded to look at water in the state, and I think a lot of the ways that you've pursued, we do have a few pieces of that grant that are really looking at local ways of knowing water, Indigenous knowledge around water, and then also kind of this narrative component, how we interact and value water. But I just really appreciate the lenses that you bring, and has made me think a lot more about like art and diverse types of narratives and how to weave those. And so I just enjoyed it a lot, and think this conversation is one that I'd like to continue in the future. So
yeah, that'd be great, Corrie. Thanks so much.
Yep, love the book. Really enjoyed reading it, actually multiple times.
Oh wow, thanks.
That just speaks to the patheticness of my life, so don't worry about it. It's also a great book. I kind of want to ask a question to reflect. It's a pedagogical question, and so because it's a challenge that I experience in my classes, any class that's environment related, because we're always talking about, wow, it's not so great right now, but it doesn't have to be this way.
Right.
So the question becomes, what are those challenges that you see in trying to get your students to conceptualize that a different world is possible?
Great question. I'm glad you asked, because this is something that I face in my classroom too. So my short answer, when students see these huge issues and we spend weeks talking about systemic problems and cover vast timescales, is that the place to start is getting involved locally, because that's really important. And they're like, that's it, just like get involved in a cause. And so the next step in that is, for example, like I taught an environmental justice class a couple of years ago. I'll be teaching it this fall again, that focuses on literary and cultural representation as a way to sort of think through their role in the environmental justice movement, which there is a big role there and it's pretty well documented. And I have them do a project I call Just Transition Project. So you can kind of see my obsession with just transition. But what I asked them to do is imagine a just transition in a community of their choice. And they can either do this through scholarship or storytelling. And most of them opt for the non-scholarship version of that. And so I leave it wide open. It's kind of like this contest we held. They can express their vision in a number of media. And so many of them have focused in the past on different Wyoming communities, and they do really cool work. So I had a student create a food justice guide for food insecure students at the University of Wyoming that covers different initiatives across the state, has recipes, has a sort of list of places to go for different types of food. So it's this educational sort of resource for students. And that's obviously, we face a huge sort of food insecurity problem here. And I had students, do podcast episodes on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples, and fossil fuel extraction in in northern Wyoming, and so much of it is focused on their communities. Occasionally, a student will like choose a random community somewhere they maybe might have a connection to, but most of the time it's rooted here in Wyoming, and so that's really cool. And then I've even advised capstone projects in the Honors College with similar types of thinking. One student did a walkable Laramie campaign, and he created like graphics for it, an Instagram campaign, and like it was all sort of framed by this research project on city walkability. So like there's a lot of this problem-based and place-based education in which, if students are free to speculate rather than just sort of do the traditional scholarship, I think can be really generative. So that's my answer there, is sort of unleashing them to really indulge in their imaginations in ways that they might not be used to doing in most classes. And I found it really inspiring.
Unless there's any other questions lurking about or amongst our commentators or Salem, I think going once, going twice. Well, thank you, Dr. Henry. I really appreciated this talk. It was absolutely a delight to have you. And I have so many follow-up questions. Being an ASU grad myself, I was especially excited, to see your chapter on what's going on in Central Arizona. So thank you so much.
Great,
yeah. So
thank you all.
of course. Go ahead. If you have anything final words to say, I just wanted to say thank you everybody for coming, and it was a good conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, no real final words, but I'd love to keep the conversation going. So if anybody ever has questions or wants to grab coffee, let me know. It's a lot of fun. So thanks so much.
Fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure.